One of them is the last name on your program for presentations. This is Priscilla Keogh, whose name was not Keogh in those days. And the other is that of the speaker around which this convention really is centered. And that is Burke Balch, attorney Burke Balch. The two of them were our first summer interns at National Right to Life Committee. And I could never have dreamed that their work over the years would have produced not only the two experienced, very capable Right to Life activists in different ways, but they both have done a very practical thing in increasing our numbers in the Right to Life movement. So I am more than inordinately proud of today's program. As you know, our new president has presented a budget which is shocking to many, dismaying to many, and frightening to many. Almost everything that he targets as ways of strengthening our future actually represent almost bottomless pits where money can flow out at a magnitude that will make the big dig a joke. Education is a wonderful thing, but for most of the time it doesn't give you immediate profits. Energy expansion, clean energy, all of the things that they focus on, wonderful things, these cost money. And healthcare reform, or in some cases healthcare deform, a bottomless bucket. And if you're going to build into that government mandated or provided deliberate killing of the future that would stabilize your economy, then you're building in your own excuses for controlling healthcare costs. But you can't ever do that, building in unnecessary operations. But someone has been thinking long before the current president came to office. Not just thinking, but studying, analyzing, planning. For those of you who heard the first seminar earlier, you are aware that you have been presented ideas which you may have had in mind, but you really have not seen in your daily communication. It is my very great pleasure to introduce and present Attorney Burke Balch, who will tell you why we don't need to expect rationing to be necessary. Welcome.
It's a great privilege, of course, always to be introduced by Dr. Jefferson. I can remember when I was a student at Williams College in northwestern Massachusetts. Dr. Jefferson was president, and I remember how inspired I was by her eloquence and her deft repertoire on debate, and she has certainly been a beacon to all of us in the pro-life movement. What I am to talk about this afternoon, I said this morning we were going to talk about the gloom and doom and the dangers, and this afternoon we're going to talk about the hope. And the fact is that one might very logically wonder whether we can, oh my heavenly, pardon me. The situation that we are constantly aware of, well, maybe I will need David. This was working. I'm sorry. Okay, next slide. Oh, please, please, don't tell me this is not going to work. This is really very heavily dependent on the slides, and if we have to do without them, it will be quite a challenge. Let's just... There we go. Now let's see if this works. Ah, all right. Deo gracias. All right. Now, the sort of thing that we are constantly told about is the rising healthcare costs. And it's gone up 4% annually each decade since the 1940s. We talked this morning about how medical inflation outpaces general inflation, and how the cost of prescription drugs are rising greater than the average rate of inflation. If you look at the premium increases, you can see that from year to year, they've been rising very dramatically. If one looks at the gross domestic product, back in 1960, less than 5% of the gross domestic product was devoted to health care. By 2007, it was about 16%, and if we were to continue on the same track, by 2040, it would be more than a third of our gross domestic product would be devoted to health care. And it's natural that when people look at this, they assume that healthcare costs are rising at such an extent that it's eating up our ability to pay for other goods and services, and we simply have to rein in the rate of increase in healthcare costs. And that is the common wisdom that you will hear from everybody from the president on down. But the paradox is, as we touched on this morning, that in fact, if you look at the real cost of healthcare, the real economic cost when you take wages into account, as a result of productivity increases, healthcare prices are actually declining in inflation-adjusted terms. Now, an obvious question is, why is it then that we're devoting larger and larger proportions of our economy to healthcare if healthcare costs are actually declining? Well, let's go over just a real quick summary of what we talked about this morning. Remember that consumer price index is an average. And the individual goods and services will rise at a higher rate or a lower rate than the average rate that you see in the announced consumer price index. And the key factor in that is how much productivity increase is there in any given, with regard to any given service or product. And remember that the real issue is, what can an average worker get with an hour's labor? Because you have to take into account the worker's wages as well as the increases in prices. If you have the worker is able to buy more hamburgers this year than the worker was able to buy for an hour's labor 10 years ago, then the real economic cost of hamburgers has gone down. So that issue, what does a good or service cost in terms of how many hours the average worker has to buy it, is related to differences in productivity. And remember, we talked about how capital-intensive parts of the economy, like manufacturing, will wind up with a higher rate of productivity increase because you can make machines work more rapidly. And that means that if you have increases in wages, which are an increase in cost to the employer, that if productivity has increased, it can offset that cost, and the real price will only go up by 1%, and the real economic cost will actually go down because the wages are going up more than the prices are going up. Okay? And we talked about how there's a difference with regard to health care, that services often are dependent upon individuals, and individuals can't be forced to work harder and harder each year in the same way that machines can be forced to work, led to work more and more efficiently. So you're going to have a lesser increase of productivity increases, a higher nominal cost, but you will still have a decrease in the cost, the real economic cost of the healthcare, because as long as there's some productivity in that sector, no matter how much, it will still be bringing the real price down. So the fundamental point is that when we look at these factors, we wind up with